The autumn fog of 1865 rolled through the streets of Paddington like a soft gray blanket, muffling the usual cacophony of horse hooves on cobblestones and the distant whistle of locomotives at the Grand Station. Captain James Whitmore, recently returned from 18 months at sea aboard the merchant vessel Britannia's Pride, stood at the corner of Sussex Gardens, breathing in the familiar scent of coal smoke mixed with the faint sweetness of bread from the nearby bakery. His weathered hands, roughened by years of hemp rope and salt spray, adjusted the collar of his shore coat, a respectable but modest garment that marked him as neither gentleman nor laborer, but something peculiarly in between. This was the curious position of the merchant seaman in Victorian society, essential to the empire's prosperity, yet never quite belonging to any particular social stratum. The Merchant Shipping Act of 1854 had changed much about his profession. Where once a ship's master operated by custom and tradition alone, now there were certificates to maintain, logs to keep with meticulous detail, and regulations that governed everything from the treatment of crew to the storage of cargo. James carried his master's certificate in his inner breast pocket, the paper soft from handling, a tangible reminder of his professional standing in this age of documentation and accountability. As he walked slowly along the tree-lined avenue, his sea legs still adjusting to the permanence of solid ground, James observed the grand terraced houses that had sprung up during his absence. Paddington was transforming before his very eyes. What had been countryside in his grandfather's time was now a thriving district, its population having swelled from a mere 1,881 souls at the century's turn to over 46,000 by 1851. The gentle clip-clop of a hansom cab passed by, its driver touching his cap in acknowledgement of James's respectable appearance. Social recognition in Victorian England was a delicate dance of clothing, bearing, and minute gestures. A merchant captain occupied that peculiar middle ground, above the common sailor certainly, yet below the merchant princes who owned the vessels he commanded. Mrs. Pemberton's establishment on Parade Street catered specifically to maritime officers on shore leave, a respectable boarding house that understood the particular needs of men who spent most of their lives at sea. The building stood 4 stories tall, its yellow London brick facade darkened by decades of soot, yet maintaining an air of solid respectability with its freshly painted black door and polished brass knocker. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax polish and lavender, with underlying notes of mutton from the evening meal being prepared in the basement kitchen. Mrs. Pemberton herself, a widow of some 60 years whose late husband had been a naval purser, greeted James with the perfect balance of warmth and propriety that characterized interactions between a landlady and her gentlemen lodgers. "Captain Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the refined but not affected tones of the respectable middle class. "Your usual room has been prepared. I trust your voyage was profitable." "Tolerably so, Mrs. Pemberton," James replied, removing his hat in the proper manner, a smooth motion that showed breeding without ostentation. "The Java trade remains steady, though the competition from steam vessels grows fiercer each season." This exchange, seemingly simple, was laden with the subtle negotiations of Victorian social interaction. By inquiring about profit rather than safety or adventure, Mrs. Pemberton acknowledged his status as a professional man of business. By responding with understated modesty, James demonstrated the proper Victorian virtue of avoiding boastfulness while still affirming his success. His room on the second floor was exactly as he remembered, the narrow bed with its horsehair mattress, the washstand with its blue and white china bowl and pitcher, the small writing desk positioned to catch the northern light from the single window. The walls were papered in a subdued pattern of ivy leaves, fashionable a decade ago, now gently fading but still respectable. James unpacked his sea chest slowly, each item finding its accustomed place. His better shore clothes, a black frock coat, gray trousers, and several white shirts with detachable collars, were hung in the wardrobe with care. These garments were his armor for navigating the complex social terrain of Victorian London, each piece carefully chosen to project respectability without presumption. The next morning, after a breakfast of kippers, eggs, and strong tea served in Mrs. Pemberton's dining room with its heavy mahogany furniture and faded turkey carpet, James ventured out to reacquaint himself with the neighborhood. Victorian Paddington was a study in social gradations, each street and square carefully calibrated to reflect the precise standing of its inhabitants. The grand squares near Hyde Park, Sussex Square, Gloucester Square, and the recently developed areas around the new Paddington station, housed the wealthy merchants, senior civil servants, and occasional minor nobility. These imposing terraces, with their columned porticos and iron railings, spoke of solid prosperity and unshakable social position. The houses grew progressively smaller and less ornate as one moved north and west, until they gave way to the cramped lodging houses near the canal where the Irish laborers and their families crowded multiple to a room. James's position as a merchant captain granted him access to certain middle rungs of this carefully ordered society. He could walk through Hyde Park without drawing suspicion, might even nod to a prosperous tradesman's wife without causing scandal, but he would never presume to approach the carriages of the truly wealthy without proper introduction. The morning air was crisp, carrying the mingled scents of horse manure, coal smoke, and fresh bread. Street vendors called their wares in voices trained to carry over the constant rumble of wheels on stone. Fresh milk. Fresh from the country. Matches. Penny a box. Watercresses. Fresh watercresses. At the corner of Edgware Road, that ancient Roman route now transformed into a bustling commercial thoroughfare, James paused to observe the morning rush. Clerks in their dark suits hurried toward the city, their faces set in expressions of determined purpose. Shopgirls in neat but plain dresses walked in pairs or small groups, their conversation animated but kept to respectable volumes. A crossing sweeper, a boy of perhaps 10 years, cleared a path through the mud for a well-dressed lady, hoping for a penny in return. James's first order of business was to report to the Board of Trade's Merchant Shipping Office, recently established as part of the new regulatory framework governing maritime commerce. The office, located in a sober building near Paddington Basin where the Grand Union Canal met the mercantile life of London, hummed with the quiet efficiency of Victorian bureaucracy. The waiting room was furnished with hard wooden benches polished smooth by years of use, its walls decorated with notices about new regulations, shipping routes, and warnings about ports where fever was prevalent. Other merchant officers waited their turn, some reading newspapers, others simply staring at the middle distance with the patience learned from long watches at sea. When his name was called, James entered the inner office where Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, a senior clerk with the Board of Trade, sat behind a massive oak desk covered with ledgers, inkwells, and brass stamps. Mr. Blackwood, a man of perhaps 45 with precisely waxed whiskers and the pallor of one who spent his life indoors, represented the new breed of civil servant who now regulated the ancient profession of seafaring. Captain Whitmore, Mr. Blackwood began, consulting a ledger with practiced efficiency. Your log books from the Britannia's Pride, if you please. James produced the required documents, the official log with its records of discipline, wages, and notable events, the ship's articles signed by every crew member, the certificates of discharge properly witnessed and stamped. The Merchant Shipping Act required masters to maintain these records with scrupulous accuracy, making them accountable not just to ship owners but to the state itself. I see you had 3 instances of insubordination during the voyage, Mr. Blackwood noted, his pen scratching notes in a separate ledger. All resolved without resorting to placing men in irons? Yes, Mr. Blackwood. Stoppage of grog ration and additional duties proved sufficient. James kept his tone neutral, professional. The days when a captain might flog a sailor at will were passing. The new laws required justification, documentation, and restraint. Very good. And the death of ordinary Seaman Collins off the Cape? Fever, sir. Contracted at Port Elizabeth. He was attended by myself, as the ship carried no surgeon, and given all possible comfort. The particulars are recorded on page 43. This exchange continued for nearly an hour, each entry scrutinized, each decision examined. It was tedious, but James understood its necessity. Too many ships were lost to incompetence or cruelty, too many sailors died from preventable causes. The statistics were sobering. In the year before last, 1,219 merchant seamen had died from accidental drowning alone. That afternoon, James received an invitation that marked a significant moment in his shore leave. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, wife of Morrison and Company shipping agents, requested his presence at her weekly tea. Such invitations were not extended lightly in Victorian society. They represented a careful calculation of social worth, professional standing, and personal reputation. Mrs. Morrison's home on Gloucester Square stood at the very edge of what might be considered fashionable Paddington. The house, 5 stories of yellow brick with white stone trim, occupied a corner position that allowed for additional windows, a subtle but unmistakable mark of prosperity. The brass door furniture gleamed like gold in the afternoon sun, and the steps were freshly scrubbed and whitened with hearthstone. James arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, neither early, which would seem eager, nor late, which would be rude. He wore his best afternoon clothes, a dark blue coat, gray trousers, and a silk cravat in a subdued pattern. His boots, polished to a military shine by Mrs. Pemberton's maid-of-all work, clicked satisfactorily on the tessellated tile of the entrance hall. The drawing room into which he was shown exemplified Victorian respectability at its most refined. Heavy velvet curtains and deep burgundy-framed windows draped with Irish lace. The furniture, all matching rosewood in the Rococo Revival style, was arranged to facilitate conversation while maintaining proper distances. Every surface bore its burden of ornament. Antimacassars protected the chair backs, doilies adorned the tables, and a collection of china shepherdesses graced the mantelpiece. Mrs. Morrison, a handsome woman of perhaps 40 years, presided over the tea table with its gleaming silver service and delicate china painted with roses. Her dress, an afternoon gown of dove-gray silk with black trim, she was in half-mourning for a distant relative, rustled softly as she rose to greet him. "Captain Whitmore, how delightful you could join us. May I present Miss Constance Hartley, her cousin Miss Jane Pembroke, and Mr. Algernon Fitzgerald from the Colonial Office." The introductions proceeded according to strict protocol. James bowed to each lady, a slight inclination for Mrs. Morrison as his hostess, a deeper bow for Miss Hartley as an unmarried lady of obvious gentility, and the same for Miss Pembroke. To Mr. Fitzgerald, he offered a firm handshake and a nod, the greeting between professional men who might be equals or might not. The afternoon would determine that delicate question. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of Victorian social art. Topics flowed from the general to the specific, never dwelling too long on anything controversial or too personal. The recent improvements to Paddington Station initiated discussion. Everyone agreed that Brunel's iron and glass cathedral to steam was a marvel of the age, though Miss Pembroke ventured that it was perhaps rather overwhelming for those of delicate sensibilities. "I understand you've recently returned from the Java trade, Captain," Mr. Fitzgerald observed, stirring his tea with a delicate silver spoon. The situation in the Dutch East Indies must be quite fascinating from a commercial perspective. This was an invitation to demonstrate knowledge without appearing boastful, to be informative without being pedantic. James navigated these waters carefully, describing the ports of Batavia and Surabaya in terms that emphasized British commercial interests while avoiding any hint of criticism toward Dutch colonial administration. One never knew who might be connected to whom in the intricate web of Victorian society. Miss Hartley, who had remained properly silent during the gentlemen's discussion of commerce, was invited by Mrs. Morrison to contribute her thoughts on the new fashion for Japanese fans, a topic that allowed her to display cultivation without seeming unfeminine. She spoke knowledgeably but briefly, her voice soft and well-modulated, her hands folded gracefully in her lap when not occupied with her teacup. As the weeks passed, James settled into the rhythm of shore life, yet remained conscious of his liminal position in society. The merchant captain of the Victorian era occupied a unique social space, essential to empire and commerce, possessed of education and authority, yet somehow not quite fitting into the established categories of British society. On Sundays, he attended service at St. Mary's Church on Paddington Green, the ancient parish church that had served the community since medieval times. The church's box pews were allocated according to social standing, and James's position, neither in the front rows reserved for the local gentry nor in the free seats at the back for the poor, perfectly exemplified his intermediate status. The sermons, delivered by the Reverend Dr. Mortimer in sonorous tones that seemed to emanate from his impressive set of white whiskers, often touched upon duty, providence, and the responsibilities of empire. These themes resonated with James, who had seen the machinery of British commerce at work in ports from Calcutta to Canton, from Melbourne to Montreal. After church, the ritual of the Sunday promenade commenced. Hyde Park, that great stage for Victorian social display, drew all classes of society, though each knew their proper place and time. The fashionable hour was between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, when carriages of the wealthy rolled slowly along the drives while pedestrians of the middle classes walked the paths, observing and being observed. James often walked with fellow maritime officers, their conversation naturally turning to ships and cargoes, to storms weathered and ports visited. Yet even among his professional peers, distinctions existed. The captain of a prestigious piano mail steamer outranked the master of a coastal collier as surely as a duke outranked a baronet. These gradations were understood implicitly, expressed in subtle deferences and careful courtesies. One Sunday, he encountered Captain Theodore Blackstone, master of the Oriental Pearl, one of Morrison and Company's newest and fastest tea clippers. Blackstone, resplendent in a coat that must have cost 3 times what James's earned, greeted him with the careful cordiality of a superior acknowledging a competent inferior. "Whitmore. Still sailing the old Java route, I hear?" "Indeed, Captain Blackstone. Steady trade, if not as glamorous as the China tea race." "Quite so, quite so. Though I hear even the Java trade is feeling the pressure from steam. The P&O is adding new routes every year." This exchange, seemingly casual, carried undertones of the anxiety that plagued sailing ship officers in the 1860s. The age of steam was dawning, and with it would come the obsolescence of skills honed over generations. A master under sail needed to read wind and weather, to understand the subtle interplay of canvas and cordage. A steam captain needed only to order full ahead and trust to his engineers. As autumn deepened into winter, the social season in Paddington intensified, bringing with it the delicate negotiations of the Victorian marriage market. For a man of James's age, 32, and position, the question of marriage was not merely personal but professional. A wife could enhance or destroy a man's prospects, provide comfort or chaos, bring connection or isolation. The difficulty for a seafaring man was compound. What respectable woman would marry a husband who spent 2/3 of his life at sea? What household could function with its master absent for 18 months at a stretch? Yet marriage was expected, almost required, for a man who wished to be taken seriously in Victorian society. Mrs. Morrison, who had taken a kindly interest in James since that first tea, began what could only be described as a campaign. Miss Constance Hartley appeared with increasing frequency at social gatherings where James was present. These meetings were, of course, entirely coincidental, or at least maintained the appearance of coincidence with scrupulous care. Miss Hartley was what Victorian society would term a very suitable young lady. At 24, she was neither too young to be silly nor too old to be desperate. Her father, Mr. Josiah Hartley, was a prosperous wine merchant with warehouses in the London docks, respectable trade money, solid without being spectacular. Her education had been appropriate to her station. She could play the pianoforte competently if not brilliantly, spoke French well enough to read Les Miserables in the original, though whether she did so was another question, and managed household accounts with precision. The courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded according to strict Victorian protocols. Conversations at tea parties led to encounters during afternoon calls, which led to carefully chaperoned walks in Hyde Park. Each step was scrutinized by society, each interaction parsed for meaning. One gray November afternoon, James found himself walking with Miss Hartley along the Serpentine, her cousin Miss Pembroke maintaining a discreet distance that allowed for private conversation while preserving propriety. The air was sharp with coming winter, and Miss Hartley's cheeks were pink beneath her bonnet, a modest creation of brown velvet trimmed with ribbon, fashionable without being ostentatious. "Captain Whitmore," she began, her voice careful and measured, "I have often wondered about the life of a sailor's wife. It must require a particular sort of fortitude." This was as close to a direct discussion of marriage as Victorian propriety would allow. James understood that his response would either advance or terminate their acquaintance. "Indeed, Miss Hartley. It is not a life for everyone. The separations are long, the reunions brief. Yet I have known many sailors' wives who found fulfillment in managing their households with independence, in raising children to be strong and self-reliant, in being part of the great enterprise of British commerce." "Independence," Miss Hartley repeated thoughtfully. "That is not a quality often encouraged in young ladies of my acquaintance." "Perhaps not encouraged," James replied, "but I believe it exists nonetheless. The Victorian ideal of the delicate female is, in my experience, somewhat at odds with reality. I have seen English women in Bombay managing households in extreme heat, in Sydney establishing businesses, in Hong Kong nursing children through tropical fevers. Strength takes many forms." This was dangerously close to radical talk, suggesting that women might possess capabilities beyond the drawing room and nursery. Yet Miss Hartley's expression showed interest rather than shock. "You have seen much of the world, Captain. I confess I envy you that. My own travels have extended no further than Brighton. The world is changing, Miss Hartley. Steamships make journeys that once took 6 months now possible in 6 weeks. Perhaps someday." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air between them. Perhaps someday she too might see those distant shores, if she were to marry a seafaring man. The annual dinner of the Paddington Merchants' Association, held in the grand dining room of the Great Western Hotel, represented one of the premier social events of the commercial calendar. The hotel, that monument to railway prosperity built alongside Brunel's great station, provided a setting of suitable grandeur for the gathering of those who had built their fortunes on trade. James had received his invitation through Mr. Morrison, a mark of significant favor. To be included among the merchants, factors, and senior captains who attended was to be recognized as a man of substance in the commercial life of the district. The dining room was a symphony in Victorian opulence. Gas chandeliers cast warm golden light over tables set with crystal and silver that sparkled like diamonds. The walls, covered in burgundy damask, were hung with paintings of notable ships and foreign ports. At the head table sat the evening's chairman, Sir Reginald Pemberton, no relation to James's landlady, whose fortune in the India trade had earned him a baronetcy and a mansion in Belgrave Square. The dinner itself was a marathon of Victorian gastronomy. The menu, printed on cards with gilt edges, promised 12 courses. Oysters on the half-shell. Mock turtle soup, Turbot with lobster sauce. Sweetbreads à la financière. Roast beef with Yorkshire pudding. Pheasant with bread sauce. Roman punch. Asparagus with hollandaise. Cabinet pudding. Welsh rarebit. Fruit and nuts. Coffee and liqueurs. Each course was accompanied by appropriate wines, hock with the fish, claret with the beef, champagne with the pudding. The Roman punch, a sorbet flavored with rum, served to clear the palate between the meat courses and prepare the stomach for the remainder of the feast. James found himself seated between Mr. Cornelius van der Berg, a Dutch merchant with interests in the Spice Islands, and Captain William Harrison of the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. The placement was significant, neither at the heights of the room's hierarchy nor lost among the nonentities at the far tables. Conversation during dinner followed predictable channels: the state of trade, the situation in the American South following their Civil War, the opening of new markets in Japan. Yet beneath the surface confidence ran currents of anxiety. The old certainties were crumbling. Steam was replacing sail. The Suez Canal, when completed, would revolutionize Eastern trade. The Americans, recovering from their war, were building merchant fleets to challenge British supremacy. "The future belongs to steam and steel," Captain Harrison proclaimed, his voice carrying the confidence of a man whose company had invested heavily in both. A sailing ship, no matter how well handled, cannot compete with the reliability of steam. Van der Berg disagreed. For bulk cargo, coal, grain, wool, sail still offers advantages. Lower operating costs, no need for coaling stations. There will always be a place for sail. James listened to these debates with mixed feelings. His entire professional life had been built on skills that might soon be obsolete. Yet he was young enough to adapt, if he chose. The Board of Trade was offering courses in steam navigation. Several of his contemporaries had already made the transition. After dinner came the toasts, to the Queen, to trade and commerce, to the ladies, who were of course not present. Then the speeches began. Sir Reginald spoke of the glories of British commerce, of the Empire's civilizing mission, of the prosperity that free trade would bring to all nations. It was the Victorian worldview distilled to its essence: confidence in progress, faith in British superiority, certainty that commerce and Christianity would together transform the world. Yet James, who had seen the opium dens of Shanghai and the slave markets of Zanzibar, though the latter were supposedly closed, understood that the reality of imperial commerce was more complex than the rhetoric suggested. As December arrived with its fog and frost, the rhythm of James's shore life settled into comfortable routine. Mornings were spent at the merchant shipping office or the Baltic coffee house, where shipping news was exchanged and cargoes arranged. Afternoons might find him calling on business associates or walking in Hyde Park when the weather permitted. Evenings were passed in Mrs. Pemberton's comfortable parlor, reading by gaslight or writing letters to distant correspondents. The parlor was a haven of Victorian domestic comfort. A coal fire crackled in the grate, its warmth supplemented by heavy curtains that kept out the December chill. The furniture, though not new, was well maintained: horsehair sofa and chairs that had molded themselves to the human form through years of use, small tables positioned to hold books and teacups, a Turkey carpet whose patterns had faded to pleasant indistinction. Other lodgers gathered here in the evenings: Mr. Patterson, a senior clerk at the Bank of England; Dr. Ashford, a physician recently returned from India; young Mr. Temple, studying for the bar. The conversation ranged widely: politics, literature, science, exploration. These were men of the educated middle class, informed about the world, engaged with the great questions of their time. One evening, the discussion turned to Darwin's theories, still controversial 6 years after the publication of Origin of Species. Surely, Mr. Patterson argued, the notion that man descended from apes is not only scientifically dubious but morally dangerous. If we are merely animals, what becomes of morality, of duty, of the soul itself? Dr. Ashford, whose years in India had perhaps broadened his perspective, responded thoughtfully. I have seen in the temples of the Hindus representations of gods that are part human, part animal. Perhaps the boundary between man and nature is not as fixed as we might wish. But without that boundary, Mr. Temple interjected, what justifies our dominion over nature, our empire over lesser races? This last comment created an uncomfortable silence. The racial theories that underpin the Victorian Empire were rarely stated so baldly in polite company. James, drawing on his years of experience in foreign ports, offered a different perspective. In my travels, I have found that men of all races share certain fundamentals: the desire for prosperity, the love of family, the capacity for both nobility and baseness. Perhaps the differences between us are less significant than we imagine. This was dangerous territory. To suggest that racial hierarchies might be artificial constructs rather than natural law was to question the foundations of the Victorian worldview. Yet the men in Mrs. Pemberton's parlor were thoughtful enough to consider ideas that might be heretical in other company. The conversation shifted to safer ground, the new Underground Railway being constructed, the latest novel by Wilkie Collins, the prospects for the coming year's trade. Yet James noticed that Dr. Ashford gave him a look of understanding, one outsider recognizing another. Christmas of 1865 arrived with a fresh fall of snow that transformed Paddington into a scene from a fairy tale. The soot-stained buildings were temporarily clothed in white, the bare trees in the squares became delicate sculptures of ice and frost, and even the usual London mud was hidden beneath a clean blanket of snow. Mrs. Pemberton, determined that her gentlemen lodgers should not feel the absence of family too keenly, threw herself into Christmas preparations with Victorian enthusiasm. The house was decorated with holly and ivy brought from the countryside, their green leaves and red berries providing spots of color against the dark woodwork. In the parlor, a Christmas tree, still a relatively new tradition, popularized by Prince Albert, stood decorated with candles, gilt nuts, and crystallized fruits. The preparations for Christmas dinner began days in advance. The kitchen, usually the domain of Mrs. Pemberton's cook and maid-of-all-work, became a center of intense activity. The plum pudding, made weeks earlier and stored in the pantry, was brought out for a final dousing with brandy. A goose, ordered specially from a poulterer known for quality, was prepared for roasting. Mince pies, their filling rich with suet, dried fruits, and spices, emerged from the oven in golden profusion. James contributed to the festivities by procuring exotic items from his travels: crystallized ginger from Canton, dates from Arabia, a small chest of fine Ceylon tea. These offerings were received with the excitement that only the foreign and unusual could generate in Victorian society. On Christmas Eve, a small party was held in the parlor. Miss Hartley and her family were invited, as were several other respectable families from the neighborhood. The evening entertainment consisted of parlor games, singing around the piano. Mrs. Pemberton played with more enthusiasm than skill, and the reading of ghost stories, a Christmas tradition that Mr. Dickens had done much to popularize. James found himself seated beside Miss Hartley for a game of whist. As partners, they played with increasing harmony, developing the wordless communication that successful card players share. Between hands, their conversation was light but meaningful. "Do you miss the sea at Christmas, Captain?" she asked, arranging her cards with delicate precision. "The sea has its own beauties at this season," James replied. "I have spent Christmas at anchor in Sydney Harbor, with the summer sun blazing and parrots calling from the shore. I have passed the day rounding Cape Horn in a gale that would have impressed Noah himself. But there is something special about an English Christmas, the combination of cold without and warmth within that seems to concentrate the feelings of home and hearth. You speak like a poet, Captain. Have you ever tried your hand at verse? Only the kind that cannot be repeated in mixed company, I'm afraid. Sailors doggerel to pass the long watches. She laughed, a genuine sound that drew glances from others in the room. Perhaps someday you might compose something more refined. The sea has inspired greater poets than you or I. This gentle teasing, the implied future in someday, the comfortable partnership of their card play, all suggested a growing intimacy that was noted by the sharp eyes of Victorian society. The year 1866 arrived with little fanfare in Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. James marked the occasion quietly, reflecting on the changes that the past months on shore had brought. His initial plan had been simple: rest, recover from the rigors of his last voyage, arrange for his next command, and return to sea. Yet increasingly, he found himself questioning this trajectory. The morning of New Year's Day brought a letter that would prove decisive. Mr. Morrison requested James's presence at his offices on Eastbourne Terrace, near the great terminus of Paddington Station. The offices of Morrison and Company occupied the second and third floors of a substantial building that exemplified commercial prosperity without ostentation. Mr. Morrison himself, a man of 50-odd years with the kind of substantial whiskers that suggested both respectability and success, received James in his private office. The room was furnished in dark mahogany, its walls lined with charts of the world's shipping routes and portraits of Morrison vessels. "Captain Whitmore," Morrison began, settling his considerable bulk into his leather chair, "I'll come straight to the point. I have a proposition for you." James waited. In business, as at sea, sometimes silence was the best navigation. You know, of course, that trade is changing. Steam is the future, not for everything, perhaps, but certainly for mail, passengers, and high-value cargo. Morrison and Company is adapting to these changes. We're investing in steam vessels, establishing coaling stations, developing new routes. A wise strategy, sir. Indeed. But here's the rub: we need men who understand both the old ways and the new. Men who can captain a sailing vessel when needed but aren't afraid of steam. Men who know the Eastern trades but can learn new routes. Most importantly, we need men who can manage not just a ship but a business. Morrison paused, allowing the implications to sink in. I'm offering you a position, Whitmore. Not just another command, but a partnership track. You'd start as senior captain with our fleet, alternating between sail and steam commands. In 5 years, if all goes well, you'd move into management, possibly as our Eastern Operations Director. It would mean less time at sea, more time in London. It would mean... He paused significantly. It would mean becoming a settled man. A family man, perhaps. The offer was extraordinary. It represented not just employment but a transformation in social standing. From working captain to merchant prince, it was the dream of every ambitious officer in the merchant service. I'm honored by your confidence, Mr. Morrison. Might I ask, why me? Morrison smiled. Several reasons. Your record is impeccable, 15 years at sea without losing a ship or a man to negligence. Your logs show attention to detail and good judgment. You've handled difficult crews without excessive brutality. But most importantly, you understand that commerce is about more than just moving cargo. It's about relationships, negotiations, understanding foreign markets and customs. Also, he paused, a twinkle in his eye. My wife speaks highly of you. She believes you have the makings of a gentleman, not just an officer. In this business, Whitmore, social connections matter as much as seamanship. The decision to accept Morrison's offer precipitated another, more personal decision. If James was to become a settled man, the question of marriage could no longer be deferred. Victorian society had little place for prosperous bachelors beyond a certain age. They were viewed with suspicion, as either libertines or somehow incomplete. The courtship of Miss Hartley, having proceeded through all the prescribed stages, had reached the point where intentions must be declared or the association ended. To continue meeting without a formal understanding would compromise her reputation. The proposal itself required careful orchestration. First, James called upon Mr. Josiah Hartley at his place of business, a wine merchant's establishment near the London docks. The meeting was formal, conducted in Mr. Hartley's office with its smell of oak casks and old ledgers. "Captain Whitmore," Mr. Hartley began, his manner that of a man conducting a business negotiation, which in many ways this was. "I understand you wish to speak to me about my daughter." "Yes, sir. I wish to request permission to pay my addresses to Miss Hartley with a view to marriage." "Your prospects?" James outlined Morrison's offer, his current financial position, modest but respectable, and his future expectations. Mr. Hartley listened with the attention of a man accustomed to evaluating risks and returns. "Your profession requires long absences." "Less so under the new arrangement. Perhaps 4 months at sea yearly, eventually less." "And you can support a wife in the manner to which Constance is accustomed?" "I believe so, sir. Not luxuriously at first, but comfortably." Mr. Hartley considered. "Constance has, I believe, some regard for you." "I will not stand in your way, Captain. But understand, I expect my daughter to be well cared for." "You have my word, sir." With paternal permission secured, James could proceed to the proposal itself. The setting was carefully chosen, the conservatory at the Morrison house during an afternoon gathering. Conservatories were considered appropriate for proposals, offering privacy while remaining technically within the public spaces of the house. The conservatory was a Victorian fantasy of iron and glass, filled with palms, ferns, and exotic flowers that perfumed the air with tropical sweetness. Moisture beaded on the glass panels, creating a sense of separation from the cold February afternoon outside. Miss Hartley stood beside a collection of orchids, their strange beauty echoing her own composed elegance. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her fair complexion, and her expression suggested she knew why James had requested this private conversation. "Miss Hartley, Constance, I believe you know the regard in which I hold you." "Captain Whitmore," she replied, her voice steady but with a slight tremor that betrayed her emotion. James took a breath, then spoke the words that Victorian convention required. "Miss Hartley, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal was formal, even stilted, yet charged with genuine feeling. This was not a love match in the romantic sense, those were for novels and the lower classes who could afford such luxuries. This was something more complex, a union of mutual respect, compatible temperaments, and aligned interests. "Captain Whitmore, James, I am sensible of the honor you do me. I accept your proposal." No kiss sealed this engagement, that would have been shockingly improper. Instead, James took her hand, still gloved, and pressed it gently. The gesture was minimal, yet in the context of Victorian restraint, it carried the weight of passion. The engagement period, properly observed, would last 6 months, time enough for preparations without suggesting either unseemly haste or problematic delay. For James, this period involved not just personal preparation but professional transition as he began his new role with Morrison and Company. His first assignment in the new position was to captain the Hindustan, a hybrid vessel that carried both sail and steam, a perfect bridge between the old world and the new. The ship was scheduled for a run to Alexandria, carrying manufactured goods out and cotton back, a route that would soon be revolutionized by the Suez Canal, still under construction. Before departing, James had to establish a household for his future bride. The selection of appropriate lodgings was crucial. They must be respectable but not pretentious, comfortable but not extravagant. After much searching, he settled on a house in Connaught Square, on the northwestern edge of fashionable Paddington. The house was narrow, just 3 windows wide, but it rose 4 stories plus servants' quarters in the attic. The rent was considerable but manageable with his new salary. Furnishing the house fell largely to Constance, operating under the guidance of her mother and the constraints of propriety. An engaged woman might shop for household items, but always accompanied and always with restraint. The Victorian home was to be a sanctuary from the commercial world, yet creating that sanctuary was itself a commercial enterprise. The drawing room was furnished in the latest style, a suite of rosewood furniture upholstered in green damask, a Brussels carpet in patterns of roses and ivy, curtains of heavy velvet with elaborate swags and fringes. Every surface would bear its burden of ornament: photographs in silver frames, china shepherdesses, small boxes of carved ivory that James had brought from the East. The dining room required a mahogany table that could extend to seat 12, with matching chairs upholstered in leather. The sideboard, massive and elaborate, would hold the wedding china and silver, gifts from family and business associates that would be carefully recorded and acknowledged. The bedroom, here propriety demanded extreme delicacy. Constance's mother managed these purchases: the brass bedstead, the wardrobe with its full-length mirror, the washstand with its china set decorated with forget-me-nots. These items were discussed in hushed tones and oblique references, as if acknowledging their purpose would be improper. The wedding took place on a bright August morning at St. Mary's Church, the ancient parish church of Paddington. The choice was significant, not one of the fashionable new churches, but the old establishment that had served the community for centuries, suggesting solid tradition rather than social climbing. James arrived early, accompanied by his best man, Captain Theodore Blackstone, a choice that represented both professional respect and social advancement, as Blackstone's agreement to serve indicated James's rising status. They waited in the vestry, James unconsciously adjusting his new morning coat, purchased specifically for the occasion from a tailor on Savile Row. The church filled gradually with guests, their placement in the pews a precise map of social relations. On the bride's side sat the prosperous merchant families of Paddington, representatives of that solid middle class that formed the backbone of Victorian commerce. On the groom's side, a smaller but notable gathering of maritime officers, Morrison and Company associates, and a few carefully selected residents from Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. Constance arrived precisely on time, a vision in white silk and orange blossoms. The white wedding dress, popularized by Queen Victoria herself, had become de rigueur for brides of the middle class and above. The dress was elaborate but not ostentatious, rows of tiny buttons down the back, Belgian lace at the collar and cuffs, a train that would require careful management but wasn't so long as to seem pretentious. The service followed the Book of Common Prayer, those ancient words that had joined countless couples: "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, and in the face of this congregation, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." When the rector asked if anyone knew of an impediment to the marriage, the silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, though it lasted only a heartbeat. The vows were exchanged with clear voices, James's carrying the authority of command, Constance's soft but firm. "I, James Edmund Whitmore, take thee, Constance Mary Hartley, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth." The wedding ring, a simple band of Welsh gold, was blessed and placed on Constance's finger. In that moment, she transformed from Miss Hartley to Mrs. Whitmore, a change that carried profound legal and social implications. She was now a married woman, her property, had she any, becoming her husband's, her legal existence subsumed into his. Yet she also gained status, protection, and purpose in Victorian society's eyes. The register was signed in the vestry, witnessed by the two fathers and Captain Blackstone. Then, to Mendelssohn's Wedding March played with enthusiasm on the church organ, the newly married couple processed down the aisle and into their new life. The wedding breakfast was held at the Great Western Hotel, that palace of Victorian hospitality beside Paddington Station. Mr. Morrison, as James's new business partner, had insisted on hosting the event, a gesture that publicly confirmed James's elevation in the commercial hierarchy. The dining room had been specially decorated for the occasion with white flowers and greenery, the tables set with the hotel's finest china and crystal. The menu was extensive but not excessive: clear soup, salmon with cucumber, roast fowls, ham, tongue, salads, jellies, creams, and of course, the wedding cake, a three-tiered creation decorated with sugar flowers and topped with a silver bell. Toasts were offered with Victorian formality. Mr. Hartley spoke of gaining a son, Mr. Morrison of gaining a partner, Captain Blackstone of the Seas losing one of their finest navigators to the bonds of matrimony. Each speech walked the careful line between sentiment and propriety, humor and respect. James's response was brief but heartfelt: "Ladies and gentlemen, I have navigated many waters in my career, but none so pleasant as those that have brought me to this harbor." To my wife, the words still felt new on his tongue, I promise that though my profession may take me to distant shores, my heart will always return to home. After the breakfast, James and Constance departed for their honeymoon, a week in Brighton, that most respectable of seaside resorts. The choice was conventional but appropriate. More exotic destinations would have seemed pretentious, while anywhere less fashionable would have been beneath their new status. As their carriage rolled through the streets of Paddington toward Victoria Station, James observed the familiar sights with new eyes. He was no longer the wandering seafarer, temporarily anchored in London between voyages. He was now a householder, a husband, a man with roots in this community. 3 months after the wedding, on a quiet October evening, James sat in his study in the house on Connaught Square. The room was small but comfortable, furnished with a desk he had purchased from a dealer in second-hand furniture. It was said to have belonged to a naval officer who had served with Nelson, shelves holding his growing collection of books on navigation and commerce, and a comfortable chair positioned to catch the light from the gas lamp. Through the window, he could see the square's garden, its trees turning gold and red in the autumn light. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the scratching of his pen as he worked on reports for Morrison and Company. Constance entered quietly, bringing him a cup of tea, not the formal tea of the drawing-room but a simple comfort between husband and wife. She had adapted to married life with the quiet competence that characterized her approach to all things. The household ran smoothly under her management, the servants, a cook, a housemaid, and a maid-of-all-work, performing their duties with the efficiency that came from clear direction and fair treatment. "Will you sail again soon?" she asked, settling into the other chair by the fire. "Next month." "The Hindustan to Bombay?" 4 months, perhaps 5. She nodded, accepting this as she accepted all aspects of their life together. "I shall be well occupied. The Ladies' Committee for the Relief of Distressed Mariners' Families has asked me to join. Mrs. Morrison sponsors it." This was the Victorian marriage at its best, a partnership of separate spheres, each supporting the other. James would sail the world's oceans, managing commerce and crew. Constance would manage the home, maintain social connections, and perform the charitable works expected of a merchant's wife. As the fire crackled in the grate and the gas lamps were lit in the square outside, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From ship's boy to captain, from seafarer to merchant, from bachelor to married man, each transformation had been navigated with care, each bringing new challenges and rewards. The Victorian age was one of transformation, and Paddington embodied all its contradictions and possibilities. Ancient roads carried modern traffic. Grand houses stood beside cramped lodgings. The steam engines that threatened sailing ships also created new opportunities for those willing to adapt. Social boundaries that seemed fixed proved permeable to those with determination and good fortune. Through the window came the distant whistle of a train departing Paddington Station, bound for Bristol and the western ports. Once, that sound would have stirred restlessness in James, a desire to be moving, exploring, voyaging. Now it simply reminded him of the world beyond, a world he still visited but no longer inhabited exclusively. Constance began to read aloud from the evening newspaper, her voice soft in the lamplight. The news was of empire and commerce, of new territories and new troubles. The Abyssinian expedition was being planned. The Suez Canal was nearing completion. The Atlantic cable had finally been successfully laid, connecting London to New York in an instant. James half listened, his mind drifting between the present comfort and future voyages. This was what he had not expected about domestic life, not its restrictions but its rhythms, not its demands but its subtle satisfactions. The house around them was solid, well built, designed to last generations. Like the best ships, it would weather storms and provide shelter, requiring only proper maintenance and care. As the evening deepened, other sounds joined the urban symphony, the lamplighter making his rounds, calling out the hour, the rumble of late carriages returning from dinner parties, somewhere, faintly, a piano playing a popular song. This was London in the age of Victoria, confident, prosperous, complex, always changing yet somehow always the same. James reached for Constance's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in public but was permissible in the privacy of their own home. Her fingers were warm, slightly roughened from household tasks she insisted on sharing with the servants. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other not passionate romance but something perhaps more valuable, companionship, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well-ordered and purposeful. The autumn of 1866 passed into winter with its particular rituals and observances. The house on Connaught Square revealed its character through the seasons, drafty in certain corners despite the best efforts of the housemaid to block gaps with strips of cloth, cozy when the fires were lit in every room, alive with the constant small sounds of a Victorian household, the rustle of servants' skirts on the stairs, the clink of china being washed in the basement kitchen, the soft thud of the carpet beater in the back garden on cleaning days. James's departure for Bombay approached with the inexorable certainty of tide tables. Preparations began weeks in advance, his sea chest packed with tropical clothing, medical supplies laid in, for the ship carried no surgeon on commercial voyages, charts updated with the latest advisories from the Admiralty. Constance managed these preparations with quiet efficiency, never complaining about the coming separation, though James sometimes caught her gazing at him with an expression of studied memorization, as if storing up his image against the lonely months ahead. This was the unspoken burden of the seafaring marriage, the constant cycle of departure and return, each goodbye a small death, each reunion a resurrection. The night before his departure, they held a small dinner party, a tradition Constance had instituted to mark his voyages. The guests were carefully chosen, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Captain and Mrs. Blackstone, Dr. Ashford from the old boarding-house days, and surprisingly, Mrs. Pemberton herself, whose establishment James still visited occasionally to call upon old friends. The conversation that evening touched upon all the great themes of the age. The Suez Canal, now just months from completion, dominated discussion. Dr. Ashford, recently returned from another stint in India, spoke of the changes he had observed. The old India hands say the country isn't what it was, he observed, carefully cutting his roast beef. The mutiny changed everything. There's less trust now, more formality between the races. The easy familiarity of the company days is gone. Perhaps that's for the best, Mrs. Morrison suggested. Too much familiarity breeds contempt, as they say. Or understanding, James countered gently. In my experience, the greatest conflicts arise from ignorance, not knowledge. Captain Blackstone, ever practical, turned the discussion to commercial matters. The canal will cut the journey to Bombay by 2/3. What takes you 4 months now will take 6 weeks. It will revolutionize Eastern trade. And make many of us obsolete, James replied. The beautiful sailing ships that round the Cape will have no purpose in a world of steam and shortcuts. You sound melancholy, Captain Whitmore, Mrs. Pemberton observed. Surely progress is to be celebrated. Progress, yes, James agreed. But perhaps we might also mourn what is lost. The sailing ship connects man to nature in a way that steam never will. Reading the wind, understanding the sea's moods, navigating by stars, these are ancient skills that will vanish within our lifetimes. The evening concluded with music. Constance played the pianoforte, a wedding gift from her parents that dominated the drawing room, while Mrs. Blackstone sang. The songs were sentimental favorites: Home, Sweet Home, The Last Rose of Summer, Annie Laurie. Music that spoke of separation and longing, of love maintained across distance and time. The morning of departure dawned gray and drizzling, typical November weather that seemed to press down upon London like a wet wool blanket. James rose early, completing his toilet with the careful attention of a man who knows he will not have such comforts for many months. His razor, freshly stropped, glided across skin that would soon be weathered by salt and sun. His collar, stiff with starch, would be replaced by the soft cotton of shipboard wear. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Constance poured tea with steady hands, but her appetite matched his own, nearly non-existent. They spoke of trivial matters: the coal merchant's bill, the invitation to Mrs. Morrison's December tea, the leak in the attic that would need attention. These mundane concerns were a comfort, suggesting continuity, a life that would persist through separation. The journey to the West India docks, where the Hindustan waited, took them through the heart of commercial London. The streets were already thick with traffic, omnibuses crowded with clerks, drays hauling goods, street vendors establishing their pitches for the day. London never slept, merely shifted from one form of activity to another. The docks themselves were a universe unto themselves, a city within the city. Warehouses rose like cliffs of brick and iron, their depths containing the wealth of empire: tea from Ceylon, silk from China, rubber from Malaya, cotton from India. The air was thick with scents: tar, hemp, spices, the muddy smell of the Thames at low tide. The Hindustan sat at her berth like a creature from mythology, part sailing ship with her 3 tall masts and complex rigging, part steam vessel with her funnel already beginning to emit the black coal smoke that marked the new age. She was painted in the Morrison Company colors: black hull with a white stripe, red boot topping at the waterline. On deck, controlled chaos reigned as the crew prepared for departure. The first mate, Mr. Harrington, a Yorkshireman with 20 years at sea, supervised the loading of last-minute cargo. The boatswain checked the rigging with the obsessive attention of a man whose life depended on rope and canvas. The chief engineer, a Scotsman named Macpherson, emerged from below decks with oil-stained hands and a satisfied expression that suggested the engines were ready. The moment of parting arrived too quickly. Victorian propriety forbade public displays of affection, but James pressed Constance's gloved hand and looked into her eyes, trying to convey what words could not. She understood, nodding slightly, her composure intact though he could see the effort it required. "Safe voyage," "James," she said simply. "I shall write from every port," he promised. "And think of you every day between." She descended the gangplank with careful dignity, then stood on the quay as the ship prepared to depart. The last lines were cast off, the paddle wheels began their slow revolution, and the Hindustan moved into the stream. James stood at the stern rail, watching Constance's figure grow smaller, until the curve of the river took her from view. For Constance, the months of James's absence developed their own rhythm and purpose. The management of a middle-class Victorian household was no simple matter, requiring careful attention to accounts, supervision of servants, and maintenance of the social connections vital to her husband's business prospects. Her day began at 7, when the housemaid, Sarah, brought hot water for washing. Breakfast at 8 was a solitary affair in the morning room, accompanied by review of household accounts and correspondence. The Morning Post might bring letters from tradesmen, invitations to social events, or, most precious, a letter from James, carried by a faster mail steamer than his own vessel. These letters were exercises in Victorian restraint, yet between the lines ran currents of deep feeling. "My dearest Constance, I write this from Aden, that furnace of a coaling station that marks the halfway point to Bombay. The heat is extraordinary, 120 degrees in the shade, if shade can be found. The crew suffers, but we maintain discipline and schedule. The steam engines consume coal at a prodigious rate, requiring constant attention from Macpherson and his black gang. I think often of our quiet evenings in Connaught Square, the comfort of your presence, the simple pleasure of tea by the fire. These memories sustain me through the watches of the night, when the stars will overhead in patterns you have never seen, the Southern Cross rising as the bear descends. The trade news will interest your father. Cotton prices remain strong, though there are rumors of American production recovering faster than expected. I have secured a cargo of first-quality Surrey cotton at favorable terms, which should please Morrison." After morning correspondence came the business of household management. The week's menus must be planned with cook, accounts settled with various merchants, repairs supervised. The Victorian middle-class home required constant maintenance, curtains cleaned, carpets beaten, silver polished, brass door fixtures shined daily. Afternoons brought social obligations. Calls must be paid and received according to strict protocol. Tuesday was her at-home day, when acquaintances might call between 3 and 5 o'clock. The ritual was precisely choreographed, visitors left cards, tea was served, conversation followed prescribed channels. These gatherings, seemingly trivial, were vital to maintaining social position and business connections. Her work with the Ladies' Committee for the Relief of Distressed Mariners' Families provided both purpose and perspective. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she joined other merchant wives at the mission house near the docks, where they distributed food, clothing, and small sums of money to the families of sailors lost at sea or injured in service. The stories she heard there haunted her quiet hours: widows with 6 children and no means of support, families evicted when the breadwinner was lost rounding Cape Horn, children sent to the workhouse when their father's ship disappeared in a typhoon. The sea that brought prosperity to families like hers brought destitution to others, a reminder of the precarious nature of maritime life. As 1867 dawned, Paddington continued its transformation from rural suburb to urban center. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, had extended its tentacles into the district, bringing with it new residents and new energy. The streets around Connaught Square, once quiet and residential, now hummed with commercial activity. The changes were not universally welcomed. Old residents complained about the noise, the crowds, the lowering of the neighborhood's tone. Yet progress was inexorable. The grand terminus of Paddington Station, Brunel's masterpiece of iron and glass, had become one of London's great gateways, connecting the capital to the west of England and Wales. Constance observed these changes from her drawing room window, watching as the character of the square evolved day by day. New families moved in, many of them, like the Whitmores, representing the commercial rather than landed wealth. The old aristocratic disdain for trade was giving way to pragmatic recognition of where real power now lay. She corresponded regularly with James's mother in Devon, a widow who had raised her son with the determination that he would rise above his origins as the son of a provincial shopkeeper. The elder Mrs. Whitmore's letters were full of pride in her son's achievements, tempered with anxiety about the dangers of his profession. "My dear Constance, I trust this finds you in good health and spirits. The newspapers are full of reports of storms in the Bay of Biscay, and I cannot help but worry, though I know James is far from there by now. A mother's fears never cease, no matter how old or accomplished her children become. I am grateful that he has you to return to. A man needs an anchor in this world, something more substantial than career or fortune. You provide that for him, my dear, and for that I am forever in your debt." Spring brought its own challenges and opportunities. The house required its annual deep cleaning, a Victorian ritual that involved taking up every carpet, washing every curtain, and scrubbing every surface. For 2 weeks, the household was in upheaval, furniture shrouded in holland covers, the family retreating to a few habitable rooms while the work proceeded. During this disruption, Constance made a discovery that would alter the trajectory of her life. She was expecting their first child. The realization came with mixed emotions: joy at the prospect of motherhood, anxiety about James's absence during this crucial time, and the practical concerns of preparing for a baby's arrival. Victorian propriety demanded that pregnancy be concealed as long as possible, referred to only in euphemisms, an interesting condition, increasing, delicate health. Yet the reality was unavoidable. Her body was changing, her energy flagging, her emotions more volatile than usual. She wrote to James immediately, though the letter would take weeks to reach him. "My dearest James, I have news that I hope will bring you as much joy as it brings me, despite the distance that separates us. We are to be blessed with a child, likely to arrive in October. Dr. Ashford, whom I consulted on your recommendation, assures me that all is progressing normally. I wish you were here to share these early days, to see the changes that daily make themselves known. Yet I am sustained by the thought of your happiness when you return to find our family increased." James received Constance's news in Bombay, standing on the quarterdeck of the Hindustan as the sun set over the Arabian Sea. The letter, water-stained from its long journey, trembled in his hands as he read and reread the words. A child. He would be a father. The knowledge transformed the remainder of the voyage. Every decision was now weighted with new responsibility. The risks he might have taken as a lone man seemed foolhardy for a father. The fortune he was accumulating through careful trading took on new purpose, not just comfort for himself and Constance, but provision for the next generation. The return voyage seemed interminable. The monsoon season made the Arabian Sea treacherous, requiring constant vigilance. The engines, pushed hard for speed, required increasingly frequent maintenance. In the Suez, they were delayed for a week while repairs were made to a damaged paddle wheel. Finally, on a foggy morning in late August 1867, the Hindustan entered the Thames estuary. The familiar landmarks emerged from the mist: the Nowhere lightship, the shores of Kent and Essex, the increasing traffic as they approached the great port of London. Constance waited at the docks, her condition now evident despite the careful draping of her cape. Victorian society might pretend that pregnancy didn't exist, but nature insisted otherwise. She stood with quiet dignity, hands folded over her expanded middle, eyes scanning the ship's deck for James's familiar figure. Their reunion was constrained by propriety in public space, but James could read the joy in her eyes, feel it in the pressure of her fingers on his arm. The carriage ride home was filled with quiet conversation, the business of the voyage, the news of London, the preparations for the baby's arrival. The house on Connaught Square had been transformed in his absence. The small room on the third floor, previously used for storage, had been converted to a nursery. The walls were painted pale yellow, suitable for either sex, furniture in white painted wood had been purchased, and a cradle, a Whitmore family heirloom sent by his mother, stood ready. "Do you approve?" Constance asked anxiously. "It's perfect," James replied, though in truth he found the miniature furniture and tiny clothes slightly overwhelming. The reality of impending fatherhood was making itself felt in ways he hadn't anticipated. October 12, 1867, dawned clear and cold. Constance had been restless all night, and by morning it was clear that her time had come. James sent the housemaid running for Dr. Ashford while the cook boiled water and prepared clean linens. The monthly nurse, Mrs. Bradley, a formidable woman who had delivered half the babies in Paddington, arrived with her bag of mysteries and took charge. James was banished to his study, as was proper. Victorian fathers had no place in the birthing room. He paced, attempted to read, paced again. The sounds from above, footsteps, muffled voices, and occasionally a cry from Constance that made his heart clench, marked the slow progress of the day. Mr. Morrison arrived in the afternoon, bringing brandy and companionship. "First child's always the hardest," he said with the wisdom of a man who had 5 of his own. "On the father, I mean. Nothing to do but wait and worry." As evening fell, a new sound emerged from above, the cry of an infant, thin but insistent. James froze, listening. Then Mrs. Bradley appeared at the study door, her face creased in a professional smile. "A son, Captain Whitmore. Healthy and whole. You may see your wife now." The bedroom had been transformed into something both familiar and strange. Constance, pale but smiling, lay propped against pillows. In her arms was a bundle of white cloth from which emerged a red, wrinkled face topped with dark hair. "Your son," she said simply, offering the bundle to James. He took the child with infinite care, surprised by how light yet solid the baby felt. His son. James Edmund Whitmore, Jr., though they would call him Edmund to avoid confusion. The baby opened unfocused eyes, seeming to look directly at his father, and James felt something shift fundamentally within himself. This was what it all meant: the dangerous voyages, the careful accumulation of wealth, the social climbing, the establishment of a household. This small, helpless being represented both culmination and beginning, the next link in a chain stretching back to unknown ancestors and forward to unimaginable futures. The household adjusted to its newest member with the controlled chaos that accompanies any infant. A wet nurse was engaged, Mrs. O'Brien, a respectable widow whose own child had recently been weaned. A nursemaid, young Betty from Yorkshire, was hired to assist. The upper floor of the house became a kingdom of infant needs, feeding schedules, washing, the constant battle against the London soot that seemed to infiltrate even the most carefully sealed nursery. James, preparing for his next voyage, postponed twice to remain for the birth, watched these developments with fascination and some bewilderment. The ordered household he had known was now subject to the whims of a tiny tyrant who recognized no schedule but his own. Yet there were moments of profound peace. Early morning, before the household stirred, James would slip into the nursery and hold his son, feeling the infant's weight against his chest, breathing the sweet milk smell of baby. These moments felt stolen from time, precious beyond any treasure he had carried across the seas. Constance recovered with the resilience that characterized her approach to all challenges. Within a month, she was again managing the household, though with new appreciation for the servants who allowed her periods of rest. The social calls resumed, now with the added dimension of other mothers comparing infant accomplishments and sharing advice both wanted and unwanted. Mrs. Morrison, establishing herself as unofficial godmother, the official honors went to Captain and Mrs. Blackstone at the christening at St. Mary's, provided guidance on everything from teething remedies to the selection of schools, though the latter was years away. "You must think ahead," she counseled over tea in Constance's drawing room. "The best schools have waiting lists. Winchester, Eton, Harrow, these decisions must be made early." The idea of sending Edmund away to school seemed impossible to contemplate while he was still unable to hold his own head up, yet James understood the logic. Education was the gateway to social advancement. His own grammar school education, while solid, had limited his options. His son would have better. On a mild evening in March 1868, James stood in his study, preparing once again for departure. The Hindustan was bound for Sydney this time, a 6-month voyage that would test the new dynamics of his family life. The past months had brought changes beyond the personal. The Suez Canal was nearing completion, promising to revolutionize Eastern trade. The Second Reform Act had extended voting rights to working-class men in the boroughs, suggesting social changes that might transform Britain as fundamentally as steam was transforming commerce. The world was accelerating, and one could either ride the wave or be crushed by it. From above came the sound of Constance singing to Edmund, a lullaby he remembered his own mother singing. "Sleep, baby, sleep. Your father guards the sheep. Your mother shakes the dreamland tree. And from it fall sweet dreams for thee." He climbed the stairs quietly, pausing in the nursery doorway. Constance sat in the rocking chair by the window, Edmund in her arms. The gaslight from the street created a soft halo around them, a Victorian Madonna and Child. She looked up, smiling at his presence. "He knows you're leaving," she said softly. "He's been fretful all day." James crossed to them, placing a hand on his son's head, feeling the soft pulse of the fontanelle. "I'll return before he's walking," he promised. "We'll be here," Constance replied, and in those 3 simple words lay the foundation of their life together, his to venture, hers to maintain, both necessary for the family's prosperity. Later, unable to sleep, James walked through the house one last time. Each room held its memories now, the drawing room where he had first entertained as a married man, the dining room where they had celebrated Edmund's christening, the study where he had paced during his son's birth. In the morning, he would return to the sea, to the life he had known since boyhood. But he was no longer the rootless wanderer who had arrived at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house 3 years ago. He was a husband, a father, a man of property and standing. Paddington had claimed him as surely as he had claimed it. The fog rolled in from the Thames, muffling the sounds of the city, creating that peculiar London atmosphere where the grand and the squalid, the ancient and the modern, all blended into a single entity. Somewhere, a church bell tolled midnight. A new day was beginning. James returned to his study and his preparations. There were manifests to review, letters to write, instructions to leave for Constance regarding household matters. The mundane business of life that, taken together, formed the substance of existence. Through his window, he could see the lights of other houses around the square, each harboring its own dramas, its own aspirations and anxieties. This was Paddington in the age of Victoria, a community of strangers bound together by proximity and shared values, by the great experiment of urban living that was transforming not just London but the world. The story of what it was really like to serve in those times, whether at sea or on shore, whether as captain or wife, master or servant, was not one of grand adventures or dramatic transformations. It was a story of daily choices, small kindnesses, quiet endurance. It was the story of ordinary people navigating extraordinary changes with whatever grace they could muster. As the night deepened and the fog thickened, James finally retired to bed, sliding carefully beside Constance so as not to wake her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the departure, the tears carefully suppressed, the long voyage ahead. But tonight, in this house in Paddington, surrounded by his small family and the accumulated treasures of a life partially lived, he was content. The gas lamp outside flickered and went out, the lamplighter would not return until evening. In the darkness, the house settled with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of wood and brick adjusting to the cool night air. These were the sounds that would echo in James's memory during long watches at sea, the sounds of home. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced a late departure from Paddington Station, bound for Bristol and the western ports. The age of steam rolled on, relentless and transforming. But here, in this moment, in this place, time seemed to pause. The Victorian world, with all its certainties and contradictions, its proprieties and hypocrisies, its tremendous energy and equally tremendous anxieties, wrapped around the sleeping household like a familiar blanket. This was what it was really like to serve in the Victorian era, not the simplified version of history books or the romanticized tales of novelists, but the complex, layered reality of lives lived within the constraints and possibilities of their time. It was a world both foreign and familiar, distant and immediate, gone forever yet somehow still present in the streets and squares of modern Paddington, in the customs and assumptions that shape us still. As sleep finally came to James, his last conscious thought was not of the voyage ahead or the challenges of command, but of the simple pleasure of lying beside his wife in their own bed, in their own house, in this corner of London that had become, against all his expectations, home. The fog rolled on, the city slept, and life, Victorian life in all its peculiar glory, continued its measured pace toward an uncertain but inevitable future.